20,000 Crusader knights looked down at the crystal-clear lake below, but between them and the water stood 30,000 Muslim soldiers. They hadn't drunk water for 2 days, cracked lips, burning throats, and death was closing in every hour, not from swords, but from thirst. Out of 1,200 elite knights, only about 200 would survive that day. Less than 1 in 5 would make it out alive. This is the story of the Battle of Hattin, fought on July 4, 1187, one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Crusades. This battle ended 88 years of European rule in the Holy Land, and Jerusalem would fall just 3 months later. But to understand why this disaster happened, we need to go back almost a century, to 1099, when it all began. That was the year the First Crusade ended, when European armies captured Jerusalem after massacring tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews inside. Jerusalem was sacred to 3 of the world's largest religions, where Jesus was crucified, where Muhammad ascended to heaven, where the Jewish temple once stood. After capturing it, the Europeans established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian state surrounded entirely by the Muslim world, like an island in the ocean. From 1099 to 1187, they controlled the Holy Land for 88 years, nearly 4 generations of people. But this kingdom had a fatal problem. It was always short of men. They depended entirely on knights from Europe, and there were never enough. And while they grew weaker, a man was uniting the Muslim world on the other side. His name was Saladin, and he wanted Jerusalem back. In 1174, Saladin united Egypt and Syria under one banner, surrounding the Kingdom of Jerusalem from both south and east. His ultimate goal was crystal clear. He wanted to reclaim Jerusalem for Muslims, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that. But here's something interesting about Saladin. He was born on the very night his family was expelled from Tikrit, a turbulent start for the man who would change history. And unlike the image of a fierce warrior, young Saladin preferred studying theology to sword fighting. He wasn't trained to be a warrior at all. On the other side, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a new king named Guy de Lusignan, a Frenchman who gained the throne by marriage, not by merit. Guy was hated by most nobles in the kingdom. They thought he was weak, indecisive, and unworthy of sitting on Jerusalem's throne. In 1185, Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem signed a truce. A temporary peace was established in the Holy Land. But this peace was about to shatter, all because of one man whose greed and arrogance would push the entire kingdom into the abyss. That man was Reynald de Chatillon, lord of the fortress of Kerak, one of the most reckless and brutal of all the Crusader lords. Reynald had spent 15 years rotting in a dungeon in Aleppo after being captured. Instead of learning caution, he became more hateful and aggressive. He was notorious for his cruelty. He once tortured a patriarch by tying him under the sun, covered in honey, so flies would swarm all over him. In late 1186, a large Muslim trade caravan passed through Reynald's territory, travelling from Egypt to Syria along the usual route. Even though the truce was still in effect, Reynald attacked the caravan, killed the guards, seized all the goods, and took the merchants hostage. His motive was simple: pure greed. He wanted the wealth in that caravan and didn't care what consequences it would bring to the whole kingdom. King Guy ordered Reynald to return the prisoners and goods to keep the peace, but Reynald flatly refused, showing contempt for both king and treaty. He replied that he was lord of his own land, just as the king was lord of his, and that he had never signed any treaty with Saladin. When news reached Saladin, he swore that he would personally kill Reynald with his own hands. This was an oath he intended to keep. But this was also exactly the excuse Saladin had been waiting for, a reason to launch holy war against Jerusalem that no one could criticize. In May 1187, Saladin's forces defeated a group of Templar knights at the Battle of Cresson, killing over 150 of them. This was a devastating loss. The Templars were the kingdom's most elite force, and they had just lost a significant portion of their strength. But that was just the beginning. Saladin began assembling a massive army from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, totaling around 30,000 men. In June, this army crossed the Jordan River and entered the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Their first target was the city of Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee. On July 2nd, Saladin began besieging Tiberias. And here's an important detail. The wife of Count Raymond III of Tripoli was trapped inside. This was a carefully laid trap. Saladin deliberately besieged the city to lure the Crusaders out of their safe position and into the desert. The question now was whether the Crusaders would be wise enough to recognize this trap, or whether they would walk right into it as Saladin hoped. The answer to that question would determine the fate of the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem and of tens of thousands of lives on both sides. When news of Saladin's siege reached them, the Crusader army had already gathered at Saphuria, a position with abundant water in the west. They had between 15 and 20,000 troops, including 1,200 heavily armoured knights, the most elite force in the entire kingdom. Among the lords was Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, one of the most powerful and experienced nobles in the kingdom. Raymond had spent 10 years as a prisoner in Aleppo. During that time, he learned Arabic, understood Muslim culture, and knew how they fought. News arrived that his wife was trapped in Tiberias under siege. Everyone expected him to demand they march to rescue her immediately, but what Raymond said shocked everyone. He said, "Don't go, don't leave Saphuria, don't fall into Saladin's trap." He explained that Tiberias could hold out, the fortress was still strong, and his wife was a strong woman who could wait. More importantly, if the Crusaders marched 30 kilometers across the desert in July, they would be exhausted before they even met the enemy. And that was exactly what Saladin wanted. He deliberately besieged Tiberias to lure the Crusaders into a battlefield of his own choosing. Raymond understood this clearly. If they stayed at Saphuria, Saladin couldn't attack because he couldn't supply water for 30,000 men. But not everyone agreed. Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Templars, stood up and violently objected, calling Raymond a coward. Riedfort and Raymond had personal conflicts going back years, and now Riedfort seized the opportunity to destroy his rival's reputation. King Guy stood between the two factions. He remembered 1183, when he was criticized as a coward for not attacking Saladin. This time, Guy wanted to prove he was brave. He didn't want to be called a coward again, even if it might cost him the entire kingdom. That night, Riedfort visited Guy privately and persuaded him with words that appealed to his ego. By morning, the decision was made. On July 3rd, 1187, King Guy ordered the entire army to march toward Tiberias, leaving their last water source behind. Raymond was right. He was right about everything. But he was dismissed, called a traitor, and now he could only lead the vanguard to their deaths. The distance from Saphuria to Tiberias was about 30 kilometers, across a barren desert with no shade and no water along the way. They carried their most precious relic, the true cross, the piece of wood believed to be from Christ's crucifixion, carried by the Bishop of Acre. The army departed in the morning sun. They didn't know this was a one-way journey, and most of them would never return. And so the Crusader army set out toward Tiberias. But in truth, they were marching toward hell, toward the death that awaited them. On July 3rd, the army began marching under the July sun of the Middle East, where temperatures could reach 40 degrees or more. From the very first kilometers, Muslim archers began harassing them constantly, firing arrows into the column, then retreating, giving them no rest. The army reached the springs of Turan around noon, but the water there was far too little for tens of thousands of men and horses dying of thirst. By midday, they had only covered half the distance, about 15 kilometers. Everyone knew they couldn't reach Tiberias before nightfall. The soldiers began collapsing from exhaustion. Wearing armor, weighing dozens of kilos under the scorching sun, lips cracked, eyes blurred, walking like corpses. Raymond suggested changing direction toward the springs of Hattin, about 6 kilometers away, hoping to find water there for the army to survive the night. That was their last hope. If there was water at Hattin, they could rest and continue marching the next morning when it was cooler. But when they arrived, they discovered something horrifying. The only well at Hattin was completely dry. Saladin had already seized all the water sources. Guy ordered the army to make camp on a hill called the Horns of Hattin, an extinct volcano with two peaks rising like horns against the sky. That night, the Muslim army completely surrounded the Crusaders. A chronicler wrote that the encirclement was so tight not even a cat could escape. Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry brush around the camp. Smoke and embers blew into the Crusader camp all night, denying them sleep. A Muslim historian wrote that the Crusaders were desperate, tormented by thirst, while Saladin's men drank water freely in the valley below. They could see the Sea of Galilee glittering in the moonlight, a vast source of water just a few kilometers away, but completely out of reach. Dawn broke on July 4th, 1187. The sun rose, and with it came death for the Crusader army. Saladin didn't rush to attack. He waited until the sun climbed high and the heat became unbearable, letting thirst finish what swords had not. The Crusaders tried to break through to reach the lake for water, but every charge was repulsed, and they grew weaker with each failed attempt. Raymond led a cavalry charge straight at the Muslim lines. And something strange happened. Saladin ordered his men to open a path and let them escape. Perhaps Saladin wanted to break the Crusaders' morale by showing their commander had fled. Or perhaps he simply didn't need to capture Raymond. Raymond escaped, but he couldn't turn back to help his comrades. He could only watch from afar as the rest of the army was crushed. No water, no sleep, no hope. The Crusader army now could only wait for death, and Saladin would not make them wait long. The Crusader infantry fled up the hill. They had no strength left to fight. Their legs felt glued to the ground by sheer exhaustion. The knights tried a few more charges, but their horses were also dying of thirst, and each charge was weaker than the last. King Guy's royal tent collapsed. This was the sign of total defeat, and cheers of victory erupted from the Muslim side. The True Cross was captured by the Muslims, a blow not just military but spiritual that shattered whatever remained of Crusader morale. King Guy and the major lords were captured alive, including Reynald de Chatillon, the man who had started it all by attacking that caravan. They were brought to Saladin's tent. Guy was trembling from fear and exhaustion. Reynald remained defiant, as if he feared nothing at all. Saladin looked at Guy and ordered cold water to be brought. He handed the cup to Guy, who drank deeply, like a drowning man being saved. Guy passed the remaining water to Reynald. But immediately Saladin grabbed it away, saying he did not give this man water and that would not save him. In Arab custom, if a host gives a guest water, it is a promise to protect that guest's life. Saladin had no such intention for Reynald. Reynald knew he was going to die. There was no escape. Saladin's oath would be fulfilled, and he would die by the hand of the man he had provoked. Saladin confronted Reynald about breaking the truce and attacking the caravan. Reynald replied that kings always act this way. He did nothing different. Saladin stood up, drew his sword, and struck Reynald between the neck and shoulder. As Reynald fell, Saladin beheaded him and dragged the body before Guy. Guy trembled violently, thinking he would be next. But Saladin looked at him and spoke words that history would remember forever. Kings do not kill kings. He explained that this man died only for his own wickedness and treachery. Guy would be spared because between kings there are certain rules. The Battle of Hattin was over. The Crusader army was completely destroyed. But for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the real catastrophe had only just begun. After executing Reynald, Saladin issued another brutal order. All captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller were to be beheaded. Around 200 knights from these two orders were executed. Saladin considered them the greatest threat and wanted none left to fight again. After Hattin, Saladin advanced like a storm. Within months, 52 cities and fortresses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem fell one after another. Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon all fell to Saladin like dominoes collapsing after the first one was pushed. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin arrived at the gates of Jerusalem, the holy city he had dreamed of his entire life. Jerusalem now had only 14 knights left to defend it. Balian of Ibelin, the commander, had to knight 60 young squires just to have enough men. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. 88 years of European rule ended in just 3 months. But there was one difference. In 1099, the Crusaders massacred Jerusalem's people. In 1187, Saladin let them pay ransom and leave. He allowed anyone who could pay to depart safely and even used his own money to ransom many poor people who couldn't afford to pay. Raymond III of Tripoli died a few months after Hattin, perhaps from illness, but many believe he died of grief over the disaster he had warned about. 88 years of building, 4 generations of people, thousands of lives, all turned to dust in a single day, not from lack of soldiers or skill, but from lack of water. From the arrogance of a king who wanted to prove he was brave, from the greed of a lord who didn't know when to stop, Raymond was right about everything. He warned them not to go, and he was called a traitor. Guy was wrong about everything, but he was king. The lesson here isn't just about military strategy. It's about listening to those who know better, about not letting ego blind you to the truth. And sometimes your enemy can show more mercy than your own foolish allies. That's what the Kingdom of Jerusalem learned far too late.